No, that's great. Could you? No, we have a lot of time. We have like another 15 minutes, and then we're gonna open up the stage for questions again in another hour. But I think the biggest question which I'm getting on text messages is really we have a lot of students that don't have any mobile experience at all. And what would be your recommendation for them about how to actually get starting with working for mobile? How to actually design for mobile? Do they buy a book or do they how do they make sure that their devices like one of the questions is how do they make sure that from building it only for a browser, how do they make sure that their application will work on all these different devices? So that's a question that's repeating a lot. So it'd be great if you could just explain to us your process of how do you make sure that your application. You already talked about your wireframes and how you think about the layout, but how do you actually make sure that it actually will look good on all these different devices?
That is a great question. So one, you're going to do lots and lots and lots of testing, and you can't get around that. So even if you think that you've designed something perfectly for the right size for the different devices, you are absolutely going to continue to test on that because as we've found at Sprint, you know, you don't really know until you actually see it, on the device. And luckily, with like Flash Builder, you can test that a lot easier. You can hook up your own phone. You could use the emulator, and all of that helps a lot.
Hmm.
If I were starting
So,
out, well, let me just say this first. So if I'm brand new to mobile, the first place you're going to go is become intimately familiar with the Android human interactions guidelines, and you're going to become intimately familiar with the iOS human interactions guidelines. And there is just a ridiculous amount of information in both of those guidelines, better on iOS than on Android. But that is the first place to go because that's really almost better than anything else. Um, Take a look at your design patterns. There's lots of great books as well out there.
so like as a developer that let's say one of our students, which we have quite a lot of them that build games, and they really
Hmm.
are edging. They really would love to build applications and convert them to build in Air, and they know that they could use Air to move them onto Android. But obviously, one of
Absolutely.
the challenges of students is that they don't have access to all these devices. And uh, are the emulators good enough to use, or do they really, to be able to succeed, they just have to have an iPhone and a good Android and test applications on both devices? Besides just
Well,
like
I think
screen
that
sizes, it really just is that. Well,
well, like I said, that's why you want to make sure you're intimately kind of familiar with that. So I'll give you an example as to why you can't just build once and export for everything. Um, the app that we were working on at the moment at Sprint, um, we didn't know. I mean, they didn't even. We kind of thought that we were going to get the iPhone, but we didn't know we were going to get the iPhone. So the app that they created first was strictly on Android, and it had checkboxes and things like that. Um, So when the UX team designed, when we actually knew that we were getting the iPhone, and so they knew that they had to create that same app for the iPhone, they basically just copied and pasted. And it was obvious that they weren't familiar with the human interactions guidelines because there are no checkboxes inside of iOS. So I can't really just design once and export for everything. So for instance, in the iOS version, there's a back button at the top because you can have that on iOS. Android doesn't have that. So, you have another method of getting, back to the home page on Android than you do on iOS. So being familiar with those guidelines is really the first and foremost, because just because you can do whatever inside of Flash Builder doesn't mean that it's actually, that app is going to be okayed for Apple, because you're not including, the correct controls, for instance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And would you recommend saying that if someone is just about starting to build for mobile, to just pick one of the devices first, build out design for that one, and not really think about both devices first, make sure that he has one application that's working for, let's say, Android? Or you think that it's a challenge that's worth taking of trying to build for both in advance? And we're talking about private people, there's no, it's much harder for a small, a student that's just starting to wrap their head around the two platforms, which are very different from a UI perspective. Would you recommend that, or do you think it's really important for them to understand the
Right.
differences
Well,
and
no,
the combinations
I think
between the
it's
two?
totally I think it's totally okay if you want to just design for Android first, for instance. If that's what, get yourself familiar. Go ahead and, create a couple of apps, and then start to, work your way, onto both sides. Because the process is, a lot different on the iOS side. It's a lot easier on the Android side. I think Flash Builder, and maybe some of the other speakers have, some other, examples here, but I think that Flash Builder does a fairly decent job of, emulating what that is going to look like on the phone.
Beautiful. So one last question. And by the way, don't worry about timing because it seems like our next speaker is late.
Oh,
But the next question comes
okay,
from
okay.
Carol, and Carol, yeah, that's like live events. That's what happens. So the next question comes from Carol, and her question is because obviously we saw in your examples some examples that are more air-like, some are more HTML-like. What is and some are you use also jQuery. What is your favorite technology to work on to create application? Does it depend on the type of the application, or what is the thought
It,
process
yeah.
involved with building it in JavaScript and so on and so forth?
I didn't hear that last part. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. The root of the question is how do you figure out what technology to use to build for mobile? Is it Air always? Is it jQuery? Is it what are your tools in your bucket that you choose from, and how do you decide what to use?
Well, and that is a great question. It really kind of depends on, depends for me on the complexity of what I'm trying to build. Sometimes if I'm really trying to create a amazing user experience, um, of course this is changing, but in the past that would always be a Flash Builder for me. Like the example that's on my screen, at the moment, that was originally this application was originally designed as a PHP application, and I just didn't have the interaction, with the ability to, pull up certain elements, by themselves, or maybe you have a 3D view of something, or I don't know. It's like I just didn't feel like I had as much control in a PHP environment. Of course, I'm not a PHP fan to begin with, but and so when it failed, and I asked if I could redo the whole application, of course I decided to do it as a Flash Builder Air application. Um, What's also just a Swift file in a browser, but it's also an Air application. Now, and the reason why I redesigned this was because I thought, oh, I don't know who's going to end up using this. Are they going to work on it on the desktop? Are they going to work on it, in a mobile or a tablet? And I wanted to do it in such a way that it was it's an application to begin with, so I like making things more, you start here, then your next, step by step, And this was able to do that. We took a 28-page PHP file, and everything that the user had to do to it is on just one page. So it just all depends. Sometimes it's really easy for me to create a HTML5 app, and if I'm going to want something to go from a browser to tablet to mobile, and I'm okay with just a little search bar and having it be a website, then I'm just going to use HTML5 and media queries and jQuery for mobile instead of making it Flash Builder.
So let me just ask, first of all, to anyone else that has a question, please feel free to text, Twitter, or use our Facebook channel. If you don't want it to be public, you could always text us at 399. If you don't mind it being public, just go on our live.html or hashtag FlashTent. So one last question about that, and then I'll turn off my mic. So really, I'm just trying to make sure that obviously also our students, which obviously, thank you so much. All this insight is golden, especially as someone that is doing this every single day, building mobile applications. So we were saying for our new students, maybe pick one. You're saying Android is probably easier. Start with Android, build an Air application for Android. Read their guidelines. Make sure that you understand them. Don't just build it and assume that it's going to work. You were saying basically get to understand the ecosystem, get to understand how users interact on Android. So the only follow-up question I would have to that, would you recommend them to start with an Air application, or would you recommend them starting actually with a simple HTML type of web app, or it doesn't matter?
I don't know that it matters, really, one way or the other. Dreamweaver CS5.5, has PhoneGap integrated. It has jQuery mobile integrated. I have the ability to, in my insert panel in Dreamweaver, I can, just drag and drop jQuery form elements, etc., into my page. It's so sneaking easy to do. It's just almost a no-brainer in creating that for both either iOS, and Android in Dreamweaver. But really the same, respect making, an Air application, if that is your skill set, could be just as, easily to do. I mean, there are a ton of examples out there of, super fast, Air apps, that you can create, mobile Air apps. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that, there's just more to it than, firing up Flash Builder, and, throwing some elements, on the page. You have to understand what your user expects and what they're, trying to do, and then, when you think that you have something, it can probably even be simpler. So you're going to have several iterations, of something. Go ahead and try it out first, and have, somebody else, try out, the app, and, see how easy it is, to maneuver. So to me, it doesn't matter. I mean, all of those things, are just a hammer. They're just a tool. It just depends on, your comfort factor with, which tool that you're the most comfortable with, and how you can, work within that tool.
Excellent. So I'll let you continue your session, and whenever you're done, I have more questions. Hopefully David will join us. And David, if you're here, please send me an email or text me or something like that, because I don't see you. So I'll let you continue, Dee. I actually have a lot more questions. This is one of the most fascinating topics. So again, thank you very much. I'm going to mute up and give you control again. And anyone else has hard questions, please feel free. I'll collect them in the meantime.